Movie Time is produced by John DeSando. Listen to shows and read reviews online at wcbe.org.
I'm John DeSando,
And I'm Mary Urbina.
and this is This Movie Time. Well, I'll tell you, Mary, I don't ordinarily have documentaries.
No, you don't.
And that's because I'm much more interested in our interpretation and our artistic appreciation. And those discussions usually end up in just saying what happens. And so, but I have three that I find fascinating. The first one is the Roadrunner about Anthony Bourdain.
Mm-hmm.
The second would be Val, about Val Kilmer.
Yeah.
Right. And now Misha and the Wolves, or as I'd like to say, Prances with Wolves.
I don't know if it was actual prancing. That would be a stretch. But Misha and the Wolves is based on a memoir that was written and published in the 1990s by a woman named Misha de Fonseca. She now lives in the United States, but she immigrated after World War II and is a victim of the Holocaust as the story unfolds.
Yeah.
This documentary doesn't really focus on her life per se as a child surviving World War II and the Holocaust, but it really focuses on what happens between her and the publisher. And really, even though that sounds a little arcane in terms of excitement, it's really presented as a thriller.
Yes, right. And that's one of the things that really fascinates me, is that it's so multi-layered. I find the story, as the world found the story, just engrossing.
Very engrossing. Misha is believed to be a hidden child who was born Jewish, and her parents placed her with a Catholic family in Belgium to protect her from the Nazis and the Holocaust, eventual tragedies of the Holocaust. And she isn't comfortable living with her family, and she wants to find her parents. This is when she's 7 years old. And she looks at a map and believes that Germany's much closer based on the paper map she's looking at in front of her than it actually is. And she proceeds to travel west on foot. And the wolves come in that she is accepted into a pack of wolves and survives with them for a certain amount of time as she tries to make her way to find her parents.
I love the fact, who was it at the beginning that says this story is just hard to believe?
Well, there were several people who, when Misha, as an adult now living in the United States in the Boston area of Massachusetts, begin to hear her story, and she's telling it for the first time. So the first was the radio interviewer,
Yes.
who was like, wow, it was too good to be true. It was too hard to believe. But wow, what a great story. And then she also shares it with her synagogue, her neighbor.
Yeah.
And then it comes to the attention of Jane Daniels, who has a small publishing company, and she convinces Misha that this should be written down as a memoir and published for the world to hear her story, but also for Jane, obviously, as the publisher, to make some money.
And the drama you were talking about, it eventuates that Misha sues Jane.
Yes.
And everything begins to collapse after that.
Yes.
And we're talking about a terrific European run, a movie. We're talking about a lot of exposure.
Well, and at one point, the book, when it originally came out, wasn't doing well, and Jane Daniels had gotten the interest of Oprah and the Oprah Book Club, and that, of course, would have been huge in terms of sales. And at that point, for whatever reason, Misha starts to pull back, and that's when the lawsuit and trial occur, which actually is found in Misha's favor. And then she takes the rights of the book to Europe, and as John described, it ensues from there that there are top sales, there's interviews, there's projects with college students, there's a movie made, a fictionalized movie based on her time with the wolves.
The lawsuit, I think, was somewhere 20 million, 22 million.
North of 20 million.
Clobbered Jane.
Yeah.
Destroyed her, ruined her.
Yeah.
But there's something very enigmatic about her to me, the publisher.
Jane?
Yes. And they do a lot of close-ups on her eyes.
They do.
And it's I just find these people, even people like her and the researchers and so on, just as interesting as Misha ever was. Of course, we do find out, as you pointed out to me, but as I knew already, that we have an actress most of the time
Yes.
playing her part. Not a problem.
No,
No?
because it's a documentary, and oftentimes
Yeah.
documentaries will use actors for reenactment
Sure.
of scenes. And in fact, the precedent is set early on in this film where you have a young girl in the snowy woods,
Yes.
footage of wolves.
I know.
It's already been established that there's some reenactment going on.
Yeah, that's Amelia Hobkinson, who plays a young girl who might be the daughter or granddaughter of the director.
Perhaps.
Although
Although he looks a little young.
Okay, so it's probably the daughter.
Maybe a niece.
We do have Laura Liberatore, who is
Yes.
playing the part. And what I find is that, first of all, she resembles her to the extent that you never would question that it was not she.
Yeah. I questioned it, but.
Did you? Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I had to, but I looked, well, okay, maybe it is, because there's a good resemblance. So that, Mary, brings you to my real interest in this. I have to go back to the 1960s to an author who was a favorite of mine named Jerzy Kosinski. And Jerzy Kosinski published The Painted Bird. He became the president of Penn for twice. He was a rock star of writers at that time. Then it was discovered that he had fudged. His story was of a young boy who was traveling across Europe to escape the Nazis. And the boy was identified with the painted bird. If you paint the bird, the other birds will attack it because they don't know who this is. Anyway, so it reminded me so much of that, it got my attention here. Because now we're entering in our show into the spoiler area.
We are in the spoiler area.
Because Mary Weldon has presented the drama, and I'm just fascinated by her story. But there is a Paul Harvey other side of the story here.
There is another side of the story. So, for those of you who don't want to know, stop listening.
Yeah, stop
Come back
listening.
later.
Go right, yeah.
But Jane, upon being ruined by the award and judgment against her, she begins to think about Misha's story a little bit more and the plausibility of it. And she is joined by a genealogist in the United States.
Isn't that cool? You wonder what genealogists do? Go ahead.
Yeah.
Besides working for police,
Right.
something like this. What a great story.
It is a great story, and it's a great, shows great advocacy for genealogists and the work that they do,
yes.
because it is very painstaking. But this genealogist joins her and then connects her to who I found to be the most compelling part of the story, Evelyn Handel, who is a genealogist doing research for the Hidden Children Foundation out of Brussels. And Evelyn, in fact, herself was a hidden child.
Yes.
And so having her join this research of trying to determine the veracity of Misha's story,
Yes.
really was quite touching and very poignant.
Oh, yeah.
And
go ahead.
I
was just going to say, no, it's okay. I'm enthralled by what you're saying. One of the things that interesting, I think Jane might have started it all when she tried to research it, because it just, she was so devastated by it. Don't you think? I thought, here's the crucial point. I thought, when she saw that the name in the European book, particularly the French-Belgian, was different from the name in the American.
Right.
Isn't that cool?
The published book that she starts to look at, there was the American version, which was the first version, and then there were all these versions in Europe. And so when she looked at the name Misha said was her adopted name, Dewal,
yes.
in the American version, in the French version, all of a sudden is Val.
Yes.
With a completely different, background to it. So she starts to question that, and that's what brings the American genealogist in, and then things that the American genealogist determines, she then brings Evelyn Handel, the Belgian
Yes.
genealogist, in. And it was really Evelyn's work
Yes.
that led to
Yeah.
the determination
Tirelessly.
of Misha's story. And they actually, it's not exciting footage from a film perspective, but it did show the painstaking work it takes for genealogists to look at actual records, because even though we live in this digital age and there's a lot that's digitized, all of these really old records at old schools and Catholic churches throughout Europe, they are not generally digitized, and she had to go through with very little information other than Misha's adoptive name, and they found her mother's name on something that Misha herself had filled
Exactly.
out when she was in the United States.
Now, you know what's gonna have to happen here, Mary, is that our listeners are gonna have to, at some point, stop in at Back Talk, which is under in WCBE on the podcast experience,
Yes.
to hear more about this story, because that's all they're gonna get. I have to exit this by saying, I think this is a great case of fake news. And I have to give Donald Trump credit for making us aware of this, even though he falsely accused the press. The point is still is there's fake news out there, and that we had number one people who were seduced, like Oprah, by this.
Well, and I would say I'm not so much enthralled by the fake news, but I'm enthralled and wish there would have been more emphasis on we as people and why we emotionally believe,
I agree.
even though
Yes.
intellectually you're thinking, I'm not sure that that's plausible.
Well, Mary, what would you recommend?
I would recommend, if you're not familiar with this story, seeking this out on Netflix, because it does, one, play like a thriller, and two, the puzzle of who's the victim and who's the villain in this really capture you as you go along with how this documentary / docudrama were made.
It's an hour and a half,
Yes.
and I think it's totally delightful.